from like a basic like physics standpoint, the stronger a muscle is, the more resistant it is to injury because it can withhold and stand like a lot more tensile force, right? So strength is the number one thing. There's going to be some diminishing returns with strength, right? There's a point where you're so strong that doing more and more strength work isn't really going to help that much. You definitely want a certain level of strength, and it's going to be a little bit different with everyone, kind of based on their injury history, based on their body size, things like that. But the number one thing is you want these muscles to be strong, especially the adductors. And then two, it's just about like load management in terms of slowly ramping up like how much you're using them in training. So like, for example, lacrosse, it's a lot of change of direction, a lot of high intensity acceleration, decelerations, getting in and out of cuts. And those are things that are going to stress the groin a lot. So just managing that load. So if you're coming in from an off season, it's like, okay, I mean, just throwing numbers out there hypothetically, I don't remember like lacrosse too much, but say in an average week, we're doing 150 high intensity XLs, decels, change of direction, like things that could be a little bit stressful on the groin. So if it's 150 in a normal week, so maybe we want to work up to that normal week. So the first week we're doing 75, the next week we're doing 115, the next week we're doing 150. So like the first 2 weeks are building up to a normal week. Then maybe a deload week after that, we're back down to close around 100, and then like super or like overload it with like a 200 week, something like that. And before like another deload going into the first game or something, if you had like a 5-week preseason. So again, I know your guys' preseason is on the shorter side, so it's a little bit harder in a team environment to mitigate those loads. So then I think the best advice for like a lacrosse player going into like a really short preseason is make sure your body is ready for what you're going to have to do in practice. So if you obviously lacrosse is a lot of XL, decel, change in direction, make sure you're doing that in your training leading up to your preseason camp, because you're not going to be able to use in your preseason camp to get in shape. It's so short, like you just get there and immediately rubber hitting the road going like 0 to 100. So you just want to make sure your body's as prepared as possible for that. So including a lot of high intensity XL, decels, change in direction in your training leading up to that camp, and then also just making sure those muscles are strong doing classic like groin strengthening exercises like lateral lunges, Copenhagen's, things like that. Mobility does play a role. I would say not as big of a role as strength, but you want mobility up to a certain point, which essentially just means you want enough mobility to be able to do the movements that you need to do for your sport. So if you're constantly performing a movement that's like really close to your end range of motion, then that can potentially cause a problem. But if you have enough mobility to do whatever actions you typically do on the field, then you're fine. You don't necessarily need any more. And actually being like hypermobile can create an issue too, because it's like a continuum in terms of joint mobility, how much stability versus mobility you have. So again, there's some gray area and some room for nuance, but in general, the more mobile a joint is, the less stable it is. And then the more stable it is, the less mobile it is. So you want to be as mobile as possible, or you want to be as stable as possible and mobile enough, if that makes sense. You want to be mobile enough, but like going too much beyond that, it's actually going to open you up for injury because your stability is going to start to decrease as your mobility increases.
Right. And I think that's a huge thing to find as an athlete. I think injury prevention, number one, strengthening and mobility. I think there's those three sort of pillars that I sort of follow. Is there anything to gauge when you're doing too much mobility stuff versus stability stuff? Is there anything that you try to look for?
No, I wouldn't say there's like a cap on how much mobility work you can use. I would say if it's taking time away from other important things, like obviously I'm a strength coach, so I'm biased towards strength training, but I think strength training is the most important thing in terms of injury prevention. So one, strength training, and then probably 1B, or both. The two most important things is how strong you are, and then your load management strategy in terms of like what your body's prepared to do and not ramping it up too much in any given situation, which again, I know it's hard in your guys' situation because you have such a short preseason. So you need both. So say you're like one of the strongest guys, like incredibly strong, but you haven't done anything lacrosse movement wise, and then all of a sudden you have this 9-day preseason going into a first match, like the chances of you getting hurt is extremely high because you're really strong, but you're still then now you're really strong in the weight room. You're exposing your muscle and like your entire body to like these movements and things that you weren't doing in the weight room, these hard change directions and like at these extremely high volumes that you can't mimic in the weight room. So making sure that, again, just your load management strategy going into these times of like super concentrated load with training and games is on point. But then on the flip side of the coin, say you're doing a lot and you've done a great job preparing your body on field for the movements that you're going to be doing in training. You're in really good shape. You've been playing a lot of lacrosse. You feel like you're ready for that concentrated loading period that's going to be like this tournament. But then your just baseline levels are really weak. You're still susceptible to injury because you just don't have that baseline strength in the muscle itself. So you definitely need both. So I would say those are the two most important things. And then I would say less important is your mobility levels. Again, it's just you want to be mobile enough, but as stable as possible. So mobile enough to do the things you need to do, and then like a ton of mobility beyond that in terms of like the joint range of motion that could actually be detrimental. And then in terms of how much mobility you're actually doing, like I said before, it's just about if you're doing so much, it's taking away from other things, like taking away from how much you're sleeping, taking away from how much you're doing in the weight room, taking away from like how much maybe fitness work you're doing if that's the off season. And usually it doesn't fall in that category. So I don't feel like I've ever had a conversation with an athlete like, hey, you really need to scale back how much mobility work you're doing. Because it's like they're doing some stretching, some mobility exercises for maybe 15, 20 minutes a day. It's not something that's cutting into other things.
Right.
I usually don't see that as an issue. But the only time I see it as an issue is when people put such a high importance on it that they're doing so much mobility as opposed to strength training, as opposed to fitness work.
With that, you talked about, so with like muscles, the most important thing is probably the muscular strength itself to help prevent injury. What about for like ligament damage stuff? So like for me personally, I did 3 ACL tears. Do you think it's same thing, like the surrounding muscle strength, or do you think it's more mobility for stuff like that? Or what do you think can help with those different types of injuries where it's not just muscular?
Yeah, it's going to be a combination of both. Like, yes, I do think the supporting musculature around it, the stronger it is, the more stable it's going to keep the joint. 2, like we talked about the load management, where the more fatigued you get, the less motor control you have. So you could be really strong, but say you're out of shape, like out of lacrosse shape, you haven't been playing a lot, and all of a sudden you start playing a lot. As you get more and more tired, like neuromuscularly, you have less control. So you could be really strong, but like late in a game, you're going to have less control over your muscles and therefore less control of your joint positions just because you're so fatigued. So like being in a good spot in terms of your fitness and in terms of like how much load you feel like you can handle from a lacrosse perspective helps a lot as well. And then unfortunately, like some people are just more susceptible to it than others. Like some people just have lax joints and lax ligaments, where you can do a lot of strength training. You can do a good amount of, I'm trying to think of what the word is. I hate keep using the word load management, but just making sure you're fit for the sport you're doing. It's not like you've done nothing and then all of a sudden you're playing lacrosse every single day. Like just being fit for your sport in terms of how much you've done on the field is maybe a better way to describe it. But even if you've done a really good job with both those things, like some people are just more susceptible to the others. But tendons and ligaments can get stronger with training, especially tendons, right? So the tendon response is delayed compared to the actual muscle response. So if you're doing a ton of strength training, the muscles are going to grow faster and get stronger faster than the tendons are going to get stronger. So that's one thing you want to be wary of too with athletes, is not doing too much so soon, because then you can start to develop like tendonitis issues and things like that, where they've gotten so much stronger muscularly in terms of their force production perspective, but their tendons haven't caught up to it. And I don't know off the top of my head what these specific timelines are, but yeah, the tendon strength, it's delayed. It takes longer to improve compared to the actual muscular strength. So just being aware of those things as well.